These days, it can be hard to trust the media. What's true, what's fake, and who is behind the message? I'm a freelance journalist and videographer who has spent years studying the media. Now I'm taking a look at what local, regional, and national news stories mean to us here in North Central Washington. I'm Dominick Bonny, and this is Common Sense. Hello and welcome to episode 64 of Common Sense. I'm Dominick Bonny, and in this episode, we're going to be hearing from longtime reporter and author David Neiwert about his decades of experience covering extremism in the Pacific Northwest. He was born and raised in Idaho, and his first job right out of college put him right down the road from the budding Aryan Nation's compound in Hayden Lake in the panhandle of Idaho. As I said, he's covered this topic for decades now, and his latest book is titled Alt America. And I also recommend checking out a copy of his book that he wrote before that, titled Red Pill, Blue Pill: How to Counteract the Conspiracy Theories That Are Killing Us, from your local library. Let's jump right into that interview now.
Yeah, my first job out of college was at the old Sandpoint Daily Bee up in the Idaho Panhandle. And I wound up being the editor of that paper for a year. And that happened to be the year that the Aryan Nations folks first started making their presence felt up there in the Panhandle. They were, I think, 40 miles south of us down there in Hayden. And I was all of 21, 22 years old and sat down with the publisher, and we decided, well, we're just not going to cover these guys because, they just want publicity and we're not going to give it to them. Right. We thought we were being very astute, right? Yeah. And of course, within a few years, we were awash in just all kinds of hate crimes throughout the region because, of course, the Aryan Nations attracted a whole lot of people to move to the area who had criminal backgrounds or were, right-wing extremists who engaged in criminal activity. And, I'd moved on from the Bee by the time they trash canned that policy, but I'm sure they did within a few years. Mm-hmm. We all recognized, well, that's not going to work. Right. We've got to cover these guys because, they're wreaking havoc in the region. They're destroying the community, and they're threatening minorities throughout the community. And it all culminated for us in a lot of ways with the 1984 rampage of the Order, which was there out of northeastern Washington. Although he recruited most of the members out of the Aryan Nations gatherings, but they would, the Order did all of its organizing up in Robert Matthews's place outside of Medellin Falls, and that's where they held their first meetings and planned their multi-state criminal rampage that included the assassination of a radio talk show host in Denver, and culminated in this great armed standoff over here in Whidbey Island, where the FBI finally cornered Matthews. He refused to come out. They lobbed a flare into the place, and it went up in flames. And thus, Bob Matthews became a martyr. And so every year on the anniversary of his death, we get these skinheads and neo-Nazis coming out to Whidbey Island to pay homage to Bob Matthews, because he's still considered one of the great martyrs for the neo-Nazis and white supremacists out there. Wow. And see, that's one I didn't know much about. You know about, I guess, Ruby Ridge and Waco, Texas, but this is one that it was news to me, who is kind of into this stuff. The Order was really, it was national news at the time because they were really probably the first serious white supremacist terrorist gang. I started writing. This was always, I was a news reporter. I worked at, I went from the Daily Bee to the Blackfoot Morning News to the Lewiston Tribune to Twin Falls Times News to the Missoulian, and then finally out here to the West Coast. And so I was we just always had to cover these guys. It was always part of our coverage because they were always committing crimes and leaving a trail of human wreckage and misery in their wake. And this is why when I first started freelancing in the early 90s, I thought, well, what do I want to cover? What do I want to have as my... And originally, I was honestly an environmental reporter. That was what I did in Missoula, and moved up to, was doing. That's how I started writing about killer whales in the 90s. Is when I moved out here to the West Coast, and thought, oh, that's a great story because it kind of wraps up all of the environmental issues in the region. Very neatly and interestingly, but. At the same time, I also started writing about these militias organizing out here as part of this anti-environmental backlash that we were seeing. And over time, the militias turned into just a pretty big story. And in 96, 95, after Oklahoma City, I was having dinner with, actually as a gathering of researchers and journalists that was called by Father Bill Wasmuth, who was the former priest there in Coeur d'Alene, who set up the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, which was basically a sort of SPLC for the Northwest that operated up until his death in the early 2000s. And but Father Bill sat and bent my ear for about an hour, telling me, what the problems that groups like his, what people like him have with journalists, which is that they tend to just parachute into stories. They don't come with any kind of institutional or deep background knowledge, and so and they often treat stories as just a sort of one-off, and they don't connect. They don't understand the underlying connective tissue. And, they don't treat it like a beat. And so I decided, well, I'm going to treat it like a beat. And there were actually a few journalists at work in the Northwest even then who were doing it as a beat. And one of them was Bill Moreland at the Spokesman Review. And over time, Bill and I became friends. We worked together at the Southern Poverty Law Center for about 6 years between 2013 and 2019. And but even before then, we'd become friends. We'd covered the Freeman standoff out in eastern Montana together. And we always exchanged ideas because Bill's a very generous guy, and he's always a great information source. So, but I pretty much modeled what I do after Bill, although he was more of a gumshoe reporter, and I'm more of a research analyst reporter. We had different styles, and I'm frankly more open about my views of things. I've especially become that way since I started. Really, I got out of newsroom work in 2000. My last newsroom job was at MSNBC between 96 and 2000. When they were first starting up, and they had their web newsroom there in Redmond. And I left newsroom work in 2000 to become a stay-at-home father because I was disgusted with the craft and the industry, particularly corporate journalism. During that time, I had just decided that it was something that really needed focusing on, and so when I was just totally freelancing after I left MSNBC, that became my primary focus.
And so this is an interesting thing too, because I've had this discussion with editors in the past of, for instance, white supremacist flyers that are distributed around town every couple of years, and with a bunch of links to websites that go some pretty dark places.
Lately, front. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and you know, I made the argument that this is newsworthy. We should cover this, you know. And the argument was, well, we don't want to give the white supremacists any publication, any publicity. And you know, so this is still a line of thinking in even modern contemporary newsrooms, even while
Sure.
we see people, specifically even in Wenatchee, Washington a couple of years ago, arm themselves to protect businesses from these busloads full of Antifa that never materialized. And so you got a bunch of guys walking around with, you know, AR-15s and these long-barreled weapons and sidearms and body armor, and they're armed to the teeth against the boogeyman.
Pick up their Gadsden flags. Yeah, I know.
Yep.
So yeah, they were also looking out for those Antifa arsonists too, if you recall.
Yeah, exactly. Well, people were posting pictures on local Facebook of a box of bricks, saying somebody left these bricks here on the side of the road to throw them. You know, so it's just this. What I referred to at the time in the paper, I wrote a piece about it, was mass hysteria. It was like a mass hysteria event.
Definitely.
And I would argue,
yeah,
and I would argue that if you refuse to cover these little things, then after a few years, or maybe 10 years of being ignored, you see something bigger happen, and that's where things can almost get dangerous. Right. So, you know, could you explain what this idea of the great, or the Northwest Imperative, or the Great Redoubt is?
Well, so this idea of setting up a sort of separate homeland for white nationalists, or in the case of the Great Redoubt, it's what their market is more like Bo Greitz's plan that he had back in the Kamiah area in the 90s, was setting up a community of patriots. And the Patriot movement really is a lot of what's actually funneling this, not so much white supremacists or neo-Nazi movements, which is what we saw, which is really what the Northwest Imperative was. Northwest Imperative was this idea that got popular within the white supremacist neo-Nazi movement in the 70s and 80s nationally. It was actually first promoted by this guy named Bob Miles, who was this pastor of this Christian Identity Church in central Michigan, who has since passed on to the Great White Father in the Sky. But Miles came up with this idea of he looked around the country and thought, well, where would be the easiest place to set up a homeland for white people that has the fewest numbers of non-white people in it.
Yeah.
And they chose the Pacific Northwest. And he was making these calls all through the late 60s and early 70s. And this guy who ran an identity church down in California named Richard Butler decided to heed that call. And he moved his operation from California up to Hayden Lake area. And that became the Aryan Nations. And so the Aryan Nations folks are basically following the blueprint of this Northwest Imperative of creating a white homeland in the Pacific Northwest. And it's had a lot of currency. It still has a fair amount of currency within white supremacist movements in the Northwest. It's just that, after Aryan Nations failed after 20 years, or 25, in 2000, they just scattered out into the woods, but they're still there and they're still talking about it. And, I really believe that a lot of the propaganda, the stuff that the press that came out then that emphasized that northern Idaho was a very white-friendly place, led to people like Mark Furman moving there, and all of these, and not only for Furman, but then that became part of this larger incoming tide of very right-wing people from, you know, Orange County and Arizona and places in California that are very right-wing, who are there to get away from the brown people. And it's totally transformed the politics of the state.
Yeah.
It's not the state that I grew up in, that's for sure.
Right.
You know, state that I grew up in, if we had been dealt with the pandemic, if we had been faced with a pandemic where we had to back our fellow community members and look out for each other, would have done everything it could to mask and vaccinate. And instead, it's become this state full of crazies who listen to conspiracy theorists. I mean, the conspiracist element's always been there. I grew up in Idaho Falls, so in a Mormon community, half my family was LDS, and believe me, the John Birch Society in the 1960s was a huge thing in that culture. And so the conspiracist mindset's always been there, but it was always counterbalanced by actually the northern Idaho, which used to be, that was the part of the state that elected Frank Church and Cecil Landris, you know. And that's all changed. That's all gone away.
Well, this is something that I think, you know, you talk about in your book, Blue Pill, Red Pill, a bit in chapter, I think, 3 or 4, where it used to be they were geographically limited, right? So you would have to almost move to a special place, near a place where you could all gather and share these ideas. And a lot of the proselytization was done almost face-to-face. You brought into the group, indoctrinated in group setting or one-on-one. Now the internet has exploded this idea or this restriction of geographical proximity, and anyone anywhere can get on a place like 4chan or Reddit and go to and just become radicalized over a course of months and years. I've actually seen it with a former friend of mine, Weeks. You know, he got really into Alex Jones, and it ruined his whole life. His wife left him, took the kid. He was really got extreme. Stay tuned for more after the break.
The 2022 Grant County Fair is excited to announce country supergroup Lone Star. They'll be playing at the fairgrounds Thursday, August 18th. Friday, August 19th, it's Cameron Marlowe. And on Wednesday, August 17th, it's the tribute bands Jukebox Heroes, Barracuda, and Stone in Love. 3 of the premier tribute bands on the West Coast. VIP seat tickets go on sale March 11th. The Grant County Fair, August 16th through the 20th.
Sports was kind of what defined me as a person. I loved to compete. I loved to play every sport I could possibly play. I think I played 8 when I was a kid. The Abbeys was really the family stomping ground for all of our community. We grew together as a community. We grew together as teams. When I drive by there, I have, dozens of memories that go through my head. Abbeys isn't just a pizza parlor. Abbeys was home.
What is home? A place to gather, a place to grow, provide shelter for the ones we love, eat, drink, restore, build trust. It's a place to rest when the workday is done, a place to find quiet after a night of good fun. What an honor we have at Guild to help own, finance, create, pave the way to live in home.
Hello and welcome back to Common Sense. Let's jump right back into my interview with reporter, author, and expert in extremism in the Pacific Northwest, David Neiwert, right now.
Honestly, that was why I wrote Red Pill, Blue Pill, is because over the years, I saw this really in my first book, in God's Country, that I wrote in 1999 about the militia movement in the Northwest and how the Freeman movement out there. And a lot of what I was writing about was how these conspiracists and how their alternative universe just tears families apart, it wrecks lives, and it leaves behind, like I say, a trail of human wreckage and misery. Yeah. And I haven't seen any right-wing extremist movement, and particularly the conspiracy theorist types, which is really what all of them are. I haven't yet seen an extremist movement that isn't fundamentally conspiracist. Yeah. But it's that conspiracist mindset that makes them really difficult to get along with.
Yeah. Well, and you make a point, and this is another point that I've heard. What was that?
They're not really living in reality.
Well, that's the problem.
They're living in this alternative universe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do you have a functioning, healthy democracy, which is kind of predicated upon a baseline of reality, of truth, of shared values? How do you maintain? It's almost like pouring sugar into the engine, right? It's not designed to deal with that. So what right. That's kind of some of my last questions is for people who maybe have a friend or relative who, like myself, have seen kind of drift into this ether of conspiracy land and start to change their personalities. What are some practical advice that you might have for people who might be dealing with that?
Well, I wouldn't recommend anybody doing it with strangers on the internet. You're not going to convince anybody in a setting. And in fact, the only things we've actually seen work in the de-radicalization zone is personal relationships, one-to-one. It's actually a really slow, fraught, and painful process, and is certainly not guaranteed success. But yeah, I mean, the first thing is to recognize who's worth your time to do this with, because it's not an easy undertaking, and it does take, you have to be serious about it. And it's also very, it's time consuming and energy consuming. So choose your de-radicalization subjects wisely, because, it should be someone you love or that you have a relationship with. And you need to leverage that relationship. Well, you need to, and this is really, what's really important is that you don't start out trying to debunk them, trying to show them the real facts. Because, of course, we know at the base of all of this stuff is the fact that they are absorbing and consuming and believing a lot of bullshit. I mean, it's just what it is. It's it's false facts. It's really it's a lot of times they'll take a little smidgen of fact and just spin it up into this whole universe of crazy. And that's not what and that's what drives us all crazy, right? But what you in those initial stages, of course, your impulse is to go, well, that's crazy, and blah 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 blah. And as soon as you do that, you become part of the conspiracy in their minds,
right?
And you become you're on the you're on the other side, and you'll never get them to change their minds, because that actually pushes them farther down the rabbit hole. Instead, it's really important. What we've found is to be empathetic, listen, and then start. Basically, you want to cultivate that relationship. You want to make it stronger, make it strong enough that it's more important to that person that your friendship with them is more important to them than those crazy beliefs. Ultimately, that's your. And then once you get there, or once you get to the point that you at least have a chance of competing with these crazy beliefs, because believe me, people get very emotionally attached to these belief systems. It's what gives their lives meaning.
Right.
It's what gives their lives purpose. Right. And that's why you saw all those people on the steps of the Capitol frothing at the mouth, because they really believed that stuff.
Right.
They believed that their America was being taken away from them, that the election had been stolen from them. Yeah. And this is why these lies and these conspiracy theories are so freaking toxic, because they just they make it so that you can't have a shared reality with them. I mean, the only reality they accept is theirs, and they think you're sheeple for doing it. And it's pretty ironic because, of course, they think they're being skeptical of everything because they think they're being smart and skeptical and insightful by being skeptical of any kind of version of the official story or from mainstream media or from authorities or whatever. But then they're incredible. That makes them in the turn, instead of taking and applying that same skepticism to Alex Jones or any of these others, they just eat it up. They just eat it up. Any alternative explanation, and particularly the crazier it gets, the more palatable it becomes, because then it becomes, it's almost part of an aspect of magical thinking that, they eventually, they really believe this stuff. And like I say, it gives their lives meaning. For a lot of people, as I mentioned in the book, the attraction of conspiracy theories is that they feel very empowering when you first start falling down those rabbit holes. It feels like you have secret knowledge nobody has, and that blah, 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 all of the things that you think you're getting ahead of the game. But what you're actually doing when you take that red pill is that you're not wakening up from the false reality. What you're doing is just swallowing a pill that puts you in somebody else's false reality. Exactly. Because all of these conspiracy theories are concocted by people with agendas who have very much their own reasons for wanting to control their sheeple audiences, frankly.
And a lot of times it comes out to this. Alex Jones makes a mint. You can go and find his finances.
$6 million, I think, between 2016 and last year.
Yeah, it's a good racket.
Yeah.
But anyway, well, thank you. We're out of time right now, but thank you for sitting down with me today and talking about this. I could talk about this stuff for hours, so I would love to maybe have you on again in the future.
Of course.
Yeah, because a big part of what I'm trying to do here with my show, and have been since the very beginning, is trying to fight back against misinformation and disinformation. So it's really valuable to have somebody with your experience, decades-long experience of dealing with it right here in the Pacific Northwest. So thanks for joining me today.
Hey, absolutely, my pleasure.
I'd like to thank David Neiwert for joining me as my guest for this episode. It's important to know and understand how misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories work in our increasingly online world, because democracy only works when the people are literate and engaged in our own government. Conspiracy theories and misinformation cause apathy, which results in citizens disengaging from the democratic process. It gums up the works of republics like ours with nonsense and leads ultimately to us mistrusting each other to such a degree that we can't accomplish anything together. I recommend picking up Neiwert's book titled Red Pill, Blue Pill, How to Counteract Conspiracy Theories That Are Killing Us, and giving it a read. That's all for this episode. Join me next week and as we head down to the Wenatchee Valley YMCA and learn about upcoming changes for that organization. I'm Dominick Bonny, and that's next time on Common Sense.
Hi, I'm Katie Joslin, and I'm a pediatrician at CVCH. We know that as new parents, you have a lot of decisions to make. At CVCH, we have a team of caring pediatricians and family medicine providers who love to take care of newborns. As you're making that decision of where you'd like to go, we hope that you'll consider coming to CVCH, where any of the providers you choose would care for your baby as if it was one of their own.
The shipments have finally arrived. And Walker's Furniture now has over $10 million of furniture and mattresses in stock. So this week we're offering big store-wide discounts and express delivery available with special 4 years interest-free financing.
Don't wait. Get it now with big-time savings on your favorite brands like Serta iComfort and Beauty Rest mattress sets.
And take advantage of some clearance items up to 70% off.
It's the perfect time to furnish your life for less this week at Walker's.
The NCWLIFE channel offers marketing packages that help you build your brand and sell your products and services. From traditional TV ads to targeted digital campaigns, let us help you build your customer base. Call NCWLIFE channel today.